evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The frustrating thing about the news media, no matter how horrible they are, is that you need them. You can't understand the world except through the news media. That's where all of our information comes from. Can't really change that at this point, but we can go into it with open eyes. And so you should know that the thing about reading the news is even when it's not intentionally dishonest, and often now it is, no matter what the intent of it, the first draft of the story that you read is always wrong. Not sometimes wrong, always wrong. Occasionally in small ways, sometimes in big and utterly distorting ways. Dewey defeats Truman, Iraq has nukes, Russia bombed its own pipeline. Stories like this are laughably untrue. They are an inversion of the truth, which inevitably emerges later. And at times it's unintentional. They just made a mistake. They got it wrong. But more often on the big stories, the ones that change policy, they are lying on purpose. So how do you know whether they're lying on purpose or whether they just got it wrong by accident? Well, when the story trends on social media, you know. That means that somewhere there's a tech executive who's decided to crank up the propaganda dial in order to manipulate you. It's really not so different from what the North Korean state news agency does. When there's a famine, they start promoting stories about record rice harvests, so you wouldn't notice. So with that in mind, it would have been worth pausing for a moment in skepticism when you saw that story in your phone yesterday about how Russia had bombed Poland. Poland is a member of NATO, the North American Treaty Organization. So are we. That means if Russia were to attack NATO, then we could very easily be obligated to attack Russia back. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So that would be inevitably, by definition, World War III. Hundreds of people might die. So this was not a small story. It was Archduke Ferdinand and Sarajevo stuff. This story came, as it so often does, from the Associated Press, citing, again, as usual, a, quote, unnamed senior U.S. intel official. So according to this unnamed intel official, Russia had launched an entirely unprovoked first strike against Poland. The Russian military had lobbed missiles into Polish territory, thereby killing 2 Poles at a farm. So, by definition, it was time for Europe and the U.S. to invoke Article 5, the collective defense principle, and begin a total war on Vladimir Putin. President Zelensky of Ukraine agreed with this. The U.S. must declare war on Russia in the wake of this story. Watch his reaction.
What we warned about a long time ago happened today. We've been saying this. Terror is not limited to our national borders. It's already spread to the territory of Moldova. And today, Russian missiles hit Poland, the territory of a friendly country. To fire missiles at NATO territory, this is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a very significant escalation. We must act.
This is a Russian missile attack on collective security. In other words, not simply on Poland or on Ukraine, but on the United States. This is an attack on the U.S. by Russia, and, quote, we must act. So this is a man with some moral authority. This is the only head of state in the world to receive a Vogue photo spread this year. This is a personal friend of Sean Penn and Ben Stiller's. And here he was commanding the U.S. to lead the Third World War immediately. So as we said, this was not a minor AP story. The only problem was it was completely and utterly wrong. Zelensky, the unnamed American intel officer, and the Associated Press had all been trafficking in dangerous misinformation. That became clear within a few hours when pictures of the exploded missile surfaced on social media. People who know a lot about military hardware started asking questions about this stuff. So they looked at a picture of a fragment of the motor from this destroyed missile, and they noticed that the ordnance was an S-300 system. Now, the S-300 system is only being used by the Ukrainian military, not the Russians. So it could not have been a Russian military attack. Somehow, Ukraine had bombed Poland and killed people. That's true. And within a day, the Pentagon, NATO, and even the government of Poland all were forced to admit that. That's what happened. Ukraine did it. But here's the interesting thing, and the thing that is relevant to us. Ukraine never admitted that. Zelensky kept lying on television. So when you run a country where the free press has been banned, as it has been in Ukraine, you may not realize that the rest of the world is not required to believe you. You can't throw them all in jail. So he kept telling you what you knew was not true. Quote, I have no doubt that this is not our missile, he said today. I believe that this was a Russian missile based on military reports. Again, that's not only untrue, it's a lie that could get millions of Americans killed. So you have to ask yourself, is it time to stop backing this guy? Could the risk be too high? He's lying on purpose to get us into a war? Maybe he's not worth supporting in the first place. Maybe he's just another corrupt Eastern European strongman in a tracksuit getting as rich as he can from American handouts. That might be the lesson, but that is not at all the lesson that the Biden administration is drawing from what just happened. Watch former Raytheon board member Lloyd Austin explain that even if the missile attack was from Ukraine, it's still Russia's fault.
This explosion was most likely the result of a Ukrainian air defense missile that unfortunately landed in Poland. And whatever the final conclusions may be, the world knows that Russia bears ultimate responsibility for this incident.
So this is not what we would refer to as evidence-based reasoning. What you're hearing from the Secretary of Defense is that Ukraine lobbed a missile into Poland and killed Poles, but you need to continue to send billions to Ukraine to fight Russia. So now you're starting to see why the unnamed intel official leaked this story to the Associated Press in the first place, this manufactured story. And the point, of course, was to manipulate the United States Congress, as so often happened. Unnamed American intel official leaks something to the New York Times, Washington Post, AP. Members of Congress read this and do what the intel agencies and the administration want them to do. And we can all but prove that in this case, because shortly after this fake news of this fake Russian missile attack appeared on the AP wire, the White House demanded another $37 billion in funding for Ukraine. So that raises the question, where does that put us? What's the total that we've sent to Ukraine so far? Well, in just 9 months, the Biden administration has committed a total of $91 billion to Ukraine at a time when our border is still open and our economy is degrading fast. So how much is that? Well, as Glenn Greenwald pointed out today, $91 billion is twice the average annual U.S. expenditure during our own war in Afghanistan. $91 billion is 33% more than the entire annual military budget of the entire country of Russia. But it's not enough. Today, Mark Milley informed us that $91 billion is just the beginning.
The United States are determined to continue to support Ukraine with the means to defend themselves for as long as it takes. We will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we will continue to support them as long as it takes. And until then, we will continue to support all the way for as long as it takes. We will be there for as long as it takes.
So there you have the obedient little general reading the talking points again, but it still doesn't answer the question, why? As long as it takes, okay. Some things are worth that commitment, but why this one? What is the point of this exactly? We can't say we're defending democracy in Ukraine, which is not a democratic country. We can't explain clearly or even at all where our national security interest lies in this conflict between two Eastern European countries. So why would we bankrupt ourselves to fund it? Could it be that this entire effort is a choreographed scam to enrich the Democratic Party and its allies and achieve left-wing ideological goals that have nothing to do with the core interests of the United States? Could it be this whole thing is BLM Eastern European edition? Well, it's possible, because that is how Washington actually works, and the brewing FTX scandal kind of exposes that. You may have read about this. FTX is the cryptocurrency exchange that just blew up in one of the single biggest one-day losses in world history, possibly the biggest ever. Now, what was FTX? It wasn't a conventional business. No, in fact, it was the finance arm of the Democratic Party. And the back-scratching, the snake eating its tail, is on full display in this story. So Democrats invited FTX's CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, to the White House to discuss crypto regulation. So the people who were supposed to be keeping this business within the lines were actually colluding with the business and doing nothing to keep it from defrauding its investors. And then in Congress, which was also supposed to be overseeing the finance sector, Maxine Waters, who chairs the Financial Services Committee, was palling around with Sam Bankman-Fried. She took the picture with him you're seeing on your screen now. That picture was taken after the first ever hearing on crypto regulations. So that's a pretty good deal. You're running a scam and the regulators are on your side. How do you keep them on your side? Well, if you're Sam Bankman-Fried, you donate nearly $40 billion to Democrats in the midterm, which he did. And that total puts him number 2 on the donor list, right below George Soros. Now, that's so obviously illegal and wrong and corrupt that you'd probably want to make sure nobody wrote about it. And that's why Sam Bankman-Fried also bought off the media. He handed millions to places like Vox, The Intercept, Semafor, ProPublica, and probably many others. So with tens of billions of dollars evaporating into thin air, and Sam Bankman-Fried not even within the borders of the United States tonight, the question is, where are investors left? There are a lot of big retirement funds who are invested in this thing, in this country and in Canada. Will they get any of their money back? What about the money that Sam Bankman-Fried gave to the Democratic Party? Will the Democrats have to give it back to the people who are defrauded? Will the media companies that took it, Semafor, for example, have to give it back to the people whose money was effectively stolen? Well, Maxine Waters was a beneficiary of this, and she was asked today whether she's returning any of these donations. Fox's Hillary Vaughn just caught up with Waters, and she made it very clear, of course, she's keeping the money.
Do you think some lawmakers that got donations from FTX's founder should give that money back?
Oh, well, I don't want to get into that. As a matter of fact, both sides, Democrats and Republicans, have received donations. So, thank you.
Yeah, everyone did it. No, actually, everyone didn't do it. This was the finance arm of the Democratic Party. One of the biggest stories of the year, maybe the last 10 years. We're going to have a lot more on it tomorrow and in the weeks to come. But why are we telling you about it tonight? We're telling you about it because you should know that FTX was also in partnership with the government of Ukraine, because all threads return to the same spool. It'd be interesting to know how much money, if any, Ukraine funneled back to FTX, which then wound up in the hands of Democrats running for Congress in this last cycle. We don't know the answer. An audit might tell us. There has been no audit. Today in the House, Marjorie Taylor Greene has been demanding an audit, but to no avail so far. And that means the tens of billions of your tax dollars the Biden administration has shoveled to the government of Ukraine remain, as of tonight, completely unaccounted for. We don't know what happened to the money. And still the Ukrainians are demanding more and trying to get us into a world war that would benefit us in no way. Are Republicans supporting this? Could any Republican possibly support this? More money for Ukraine with no audit? Any Republican who does deserves, at the very least, a lifetime of scorn. One who doesn't is Thomas Massie, who represents the Commonwealth of Kentucky in the Congress. He joins us tonight. Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. So it seems pretty clear that this story was planted by the U.S. intel agencies and on the AP wire to convince you in the Congress to send another tranche of $37 billion to the government of Ukraine. That feels like manipulation by our intel agencies to me.
Yeah, and if I may respond to one other thing in your monologue there, there's a myth about the NATO treaty that Article 5 is somehow short-circuiting Congress's responsibility to decide when and if we go to war. Article 11, which almost nobody has read, says that all of the member states have to carry out the other articles in compliance with their own constitutions. Our Constitution requires not just the Senate to confirm a treaty, but for the House and the Senate both to agree to commit an act of war or to commit our soldiers to war. So that, you know, if any of my colleagues here in the House or the Senate are listening, please go read the rest of the NATO treaty. As far as the money, Tucker, they're doing something very despicable here with these last tranches of money. We had a clear-cut vote on about $40 billion, and we had 57 Republicans, those are your true conservatives, who voted against that $40 billion. But recently, the last tranche, they tied it to hurricane relief in Florida. So think about this. If you wanted to help hurricane victims in Florida with your vote in Washington, D.C., you had to increase the chance that we would have victims of nuclear war. It's despicable and it's wrong, and they're going to try and do that with the next tranche of money. They're going to tie it to more disaster relief and other government funding.
This is so obviously a scam. I mean, it's an ideological jihad. It's a holy war being waged by some on the left against Russia for their own creepy ideological reasons, but it's also a money-making opportunity for war profiteers, including one prominent Democrat who's trying to do an arms deal in Ukraine right now. We'll tell you about that tomorrow. But I don't understand how Congress can appropriate a single more dollar without an audit that tells us what happened to the other tens of billions you've already sent.
That's right. We should absolutely refuse to send another single penny there until we get an audit and an inspector general. Senator Rand Paul tried to make this stand in the Senate, only got 11 of his colleagues there to agree that we need an inspector general. Look, in Afghanistan, we were spending about $50 billion a year. We're on course to spend about twice of that in Ukraine, and we had an inspector general in Afghanistan. We absolutely need one here. We found all sorts of waste, fraud, and abuse from Inspector General John Sopko. So we need one here in the Ukraine immediately. And we shouldn't be sending any more money. And there's one other thing we should demand. You know, the guy that you quoted there said, we'll do it for as long as it takes. The thing we never had in Afghanistan and we don't have in Ukraine is, what is your definition of victory? Are you going to retake Crimea? What's your definition of victory? The American voters deserve to know.
Well, regime change in Moscow, of course, is the goal of this. Yeah. So Republicans now officially, as of an hour ago, control the House of Representatives. Republican control of one chamber of the Congress. Can you stop this?
We can absolutely stop this. Now, it might, unfortunately, the Democrats are going to pass a spending bill here in the lame duck, and some senators are probably going to go along with that, and the Senate Republicans, unfortunately, which will tie our spending hands until September 30th of 2023. But there's going to be two types of bills. For your viewers, I want them to know this. There's going to be two types of bills that pass the Republican Congress. Imaginary pretend messaging bills that are going to be full of great policy but going nowhere in the Senate. The second type of bill is spending bills. And on these spending bills, we need to demand that we defund these things. All of the executive orders need to be defunded, and we certainly shouldn't be sending another penny to Ukraine.
It's just crazy how many Republicans got hoodwinked by this scam. It really is the foreign policy version of BLM, and they're still going along with it, and it blows my mind. I appreciate your clarity. Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Thank you.
Thank you, Tucker.
This is Fox News Alert. As we just told you, the Associated Press has made a call, is projecting the Republicans will, in fact, take control very narrowly of the House of Representatives. Joe Biden has issued this statement, quote, "I congratulate Leader McCarthy on Republicans winning the House majority. I'm ready to work with House Republicans to deliver results for working families," none of which he means. As of now, Republicans are projected to control at least 218 seats in the House and maybe a few more. In the Senate, Democrats will retain the majority. They have 50 seats. That gives them control of the chamber because, of course, the vice president cast the tie-breaking vote. There is a runoff in Georgia in December. Donald Trump announced last night, as you know, that he's running for president once again in 2024, but he continues to remain censored on social media. So whatever you think of Trump, how can this be happening? In a democracy, how can a presidential candidate be prevented from speaking in public? Where are the defenders of democracy tonight? More on that in a minute. In Florida last night, Donald Trump announced that he is running for president again. If you've been following his rallies that he has done around the country for the last couple of years, some of it seemed familiar. But there were parts of the speech where he offered solutions to problems that you haven't heard before and that nobody seems to be talking about, at least in the way that he spoke about last night. The fentanyl crisis, for example. He offered a plan to fix it. He said he would wage war on the Mexican drug cartels and institute the death penalty for people who deal fentanyl.
We will wage war upon the cartels and stop the fentanyl and deadly drugs from killing 200,000 Americans per year. And I will ask Congress for legislation ensuring that drug dealers and human traffickers, these are terrible, terrible, horrible people who are responsible for death, carnage, and crime all over our country. Every drug dealer during his or her life on average will kill 500 people with the drugs they sell, not to mention the destruction of families. But we're going to be asking everyone who sells drugs, gets caught selling drugs, to receive the death penalty for their heinous acts.
Now, that's an interesting idea. You may like it. You may not like it. By the way, you may like Trump. You may not like Trump. You could be a Democrat who lives to despise him. You could be a Republican who prefers Ron DeSantis. There are many of both of those categories. You may be someone who loves him. It doesn't really matter what you think of Trump or his policies on fentanyl or anything else. If you're an American, you have to acknowledge that in order for our democracy to function, candidates for office, political candidates, have to be allowed to speak in public. If they can't speak in public, this can't be a democracy by definition. And yet here you have Twitter banning Trump. He's still banned, despite Elon Musk's takeover. Trump is still banned from Twitter tonight, one of our premier social media platforms. Parler, you'll remember, was pulled off the internet for giving Donald Trump an account. Now, at the time, people read those as offenses against Trump. We're sick of Trump, make him shut up. But they're more than that. They're attacks on our system. They're attacks on democracy. They're attacks on the possibility of a free society. So you have to wonder now, where are the defenders of democracy? People were yelling last week about democracy's dying. If they're not calling for Trump to be re-platformed, you will know for certain they're not defenders of democracy, they're totalitarians. Justin Trudeau loves China. He talks about it all the time. The other day, he met his hero, Xi Jinping, at the G20. It sadly didn't go very well. It's an amazing story. Fox's Trace Gallagher has it for us. Hey, Trace.
Hey, Tucker, and for Trudeau, this is humiliation on a grand scale, not just because it happened at the gathering of the world's biggest economies and most powerful leaders, but that it happened in public, on camera. And when Chinese President Xi was finished, we did not need a translator to figure out that the prime minister who likes to play dress up got dressed down. Watch.
If everything we discuss is leaked to the paper, that's not appropriate. And that's not how the way the conversation was conducted. If there is sincerity on your part,
free and open and frank dialogue, and that is what we will continue to have. We will continue to look to work constructively together, but there will be things we will disagree on, and we will have to.
Let's create the conditions first.
I mean, even after President Xi walked away, his translator was still giving Trudeau the what for. And for context, President Xi was angry that an informal conversation between the two leaders a day earlier was leaked to the media. During that meeting, Trudeau raised concerns about what he calls China's interference in Canadian affairs. But remember, the Chinese leader lives in a world with very little dissent. He's about to serve an unprecedented third term, has total control over his military and Politburo, meaning that he has no checks and balances. So really, the only way for the prime minister to challenge President Xi would be for him to call on his alter ego, Geronimo Trudeau. Tucker.
The prime minister likes to dress up, gets dressed down. There's a reason that Trace Gallagher, in his new job, host of Fox News at Night, every weeknight at midnight, is killing it in the ratings. Not surprisingly at all. Congratulations. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Tucker.
So there are many drug epidemics actually occurring simultaneously across this country. The homeless encampments you see across the country are evidence of one, but there's another that is not so obvious, but very destructive. Adderall, essentially medical meth, has never been easier to obtain than it is now, and we've never had a moment when more Americans were using it and addicted to it and being harmed by it. Medical expert Dr. Mark Siegel joins us next to assess. So there is a drug epidemic in this country that virtually nobody talks about, and it involves children, and it's Adderall. Adderall is easier to get now than it's ever been. Millions of people are addicted to it. The damage from long-term Adderall use can be profound to the brain. Withdrawal from Adderall can be terrifying. And yet its usage is increasing. In the last year, more than 40 million prescriptions for Adderall, which is in some ways very similar to methamphetamine, hard even to tell in a tox screen which is which. 40 million prescriptions were dispensed in this country. Social media inundated with advertisements instructing young people to take more Adderall for attention deficit problems. They want to do good in school, take more Adderall. So much Adderall is being consumed in this country that there appears to be an Adderall shortage. What is happening here, and why is no one talking about this? Dr. Mark Siegel joins us tonight to assess what is going on. Doctor, thanks for joining us.
Tucker, good to be with you. You know, I could talk about the supposed shortage with the FDA saying there's a shortage, and I could talk about supply chain issues coming out of China, and I could talk about the generics, but I want to talk about what you just mentioned, which is What is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and who's getting Adderall, and who's prescribing this stuff? Because millions of kids and teens come to doctors' offices like mine already on the medication. They didn't get neuropsych testing. They weren't seen by a neurologist or a psychiatrist or a well-trained psychologist. They got it from a primary care doctor or from somewhere else. And the reason you just said, maybe they do better on tests as a result, you know, maybe they do better in work as a result, but then they stay up all night, or they have problems with nausea, they have problems with focusing, their heart rate goes up, there can be heart issues involved. This is speed. This stuff is speed. And I'm concerned about the fact that during the pandemic, this has gotten a lot worse. We had over, as you said, 41 million prescriptions last year, up from over 30 the year before. This is skyrocketing, and social media is involved, and copycatting is involved. But I'm concerned that doctors are being pressured to prescribe this stuff for people for just what I said, outcome analysis. In other words, you take it, you do better on a test. Does that mean you need it? Absolutely not. And we don't know the long-term consequences. And the last point is this. You know, there's companies out there profiting off of this. One called Cerebral that the Wall Street Journal has targeted and investigated is under federal investigation now because of telehealth, Tucker. Telehealth made it so much easier. You don't even have to see the patient, right? You just dump out a prescription. And what happens once doctors wake up and pull back? You know what happens. Kids and teens and young adults go for illicit use, and they end up with a product laced with fentanyl, Tucker.
But the long-term effects of amphetamine use are well documented, and it corrodes your personality. It causes brain damage. Like, I just can't even believe doctors would prescribe this stuff for 15 years to people, but they do.
Tucker, it causes personality changes, it can cause long-term brain changes, and it's bad for your heart. And that's probably the most important thing, because people out there don't know. They could have underlying heart disease and not know it. The last thing I want to do is jack up somebody's blood pressure and heart rate, but that's what this does. And people get addicted to it. We don't call it an addiction, but it's an addiction.
Of course it is. And it's it everywhere. Dr. Mark Siegel, thank you for that clarity. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
So you may have noticed, this is a meme almost on social media, that violent crimes against Asian Americans are skyrocketing in the United States, and that actually seems to be true. Why is it happening is the question, and of course it's white supremacy! Except the weird thing is a lot of the attackers don't really look like white supremacists. They don't fit the profile. So what is going on? Well, author and activist Ying Ma has looked into it. She, in fact, wrote a book on her own experience growing up in Oakland. And we spoke to her for a brand new episode of Tucker Carlson today, which was fascinating. Here's part of it.
In Oakland, just in the last few months, we've seen some horrific killings of Asian immigrants as well, and they were, you know, there's an Uber driver who was recently killed by two attackers, and then there's a beloved dentist who was recently kind of dragged out of her car as well, and she was killed too, and both of those looked like they were robberies gone bad, but they also both looked like the victims might have been racially profiled by the perpetrators as targets who were, you know, easier to commit crimes against. So we're still seeing a whole lot of dysfunction.
I should also point out that Oakland is maybe the most liberal community in the United States. It has the most liberal member of Congress, Barbara Lee, and it's always been very liberal. So, I mean, I don't know how you measure liberal, but it's a Democratic, impregnable Democratic Party stronghold, period.
Absolutely, yeah.
Democrats run Oakland. They have for many, many years, decades. So in the middle of this progressive paradise, you have race killings, a lot of them. What does that tell? What does that tell you?
I mean, it's crazy, and it's a complicated mess. We've seen many instances of Asian Americans being attacked in horrific ways, and the perpetrators are not white. And these crimes, many of them have happened in America's largest or most dangerous cities. We've actually seen a lot of noises being made by left-wing Asian American activists, and many of them chimed in. So certainly in the past couple of years, as a result of COVID and as a result of the increase in anti-Asian violence and the increased awareness of it, we've seen a lot of these left-wing Asian American activists chime in and say this is a result of white supremacy, this is a result of this racist superstructure that we have in America, and many of them have blamed former President Trump for his COVID rhetoric. I think that...
Were you ever attacked by white supremacists in Oakland?
No, I was not.
Did you ever know anyone who was?
I did not know any white supremacists in Oakland.
Okay.
And
how big is the white supremacist community in Oakland?
I was not aware of it.
You can watch our full interview with Yingma tomorrow on Fox Nation tomorrow morning. It's worth it. So drug addiction, the drug epidemic, really driven by China through Mexico, is rearranging the fabric of the country. Millions of Americans have had their lives destroyed. That is a well-known and very depressing story. Our next guest is one of those who managed to turn her life around after years and years of horrifying addiction. And she gained insights in the process that tell us what we probably ought to be doing right now to stop this. She joins us next. Well, it's been over a week since the midterm elections, and there are still a number of U.S. House races whose outcomes we don't know. Officials are continuing to, quote, count the votes in those races. In California's 3rd congressional district, for example, only 60% of the ballots have been tallied as of tonight, after 8 days. Is there something about vote counting we don't know? Isn't it just adding up all the votes? How did simple addition become such a complex and time-consuming task in a country that does heart transplants and has a space program? We honestly don't know the answer. No one's really explained it to us. We have noticed that this sort of thing doesn't seem to happen very often in Republican districts. Maybe you've got a theory as to why. What we can tell you conclusively is who is benefiting from it, because that's measurable. As in many recent elections that we've already told you about, in the overwhelming majority of races this cycle, where there was a reported problem with voting equipment or a long delay in vote counting, Democrats won. The overwhelming majority. And that's not a guess. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's math. Of the 40 races in this year's midterms that took at least 2 days to count, 28 of them went to Democrats. That's 70%. So if the chaos at polling places was organic and randomly distributed, you would expect each party to benefit at roughly the same rate, 50%. But no, 70% went to Democratic candidates. Are you surprised by that? You're probably not surprised. When vote counting was paused in various places on election night 2020, how shocked were you really when Joe Biden won? When a huge percentage of polling places in Arizona reported serious problems on election day, malfunctioning equipment, printers that were somehow out of ink, were you really stunned when Blake Masters and Kerry Lake lost? We doubt you were, because you're getting used to how this really works. Can we call it voter fraud? No, we can't. We don't have the evidence. We can call it unacceptable, because it is. When equipment malfunctions or it takes days to count the votes, Americans lose their faith in their democratic system. And when they lose that faith, they tend to become radical. And over time, they can become dangerous, because democracy is the safety relief valve that keeps things from blowing up. Whether or not the system is actually rigged, there is no doubt that it certainly looks like it's rigged. And that alone, just the appearance of it, is a disaster for all of us. So you would think both parties would want to fix this for the sake of democracy, the democracy we claim to care so much about. But no, only one party wants to fix it. Only one party even notices. The other party is benefiting from it. So in the run-up to last Tuesday's election, you heard a lot of people on the left, the water carriers to the Democratic Party on MSNBC, for example, telling you that crime was imaginary and you were a racist to notice, but it's not imaginary, it's totally real. And it's gotten so bad that in some cities, criminals are not even waiting until nighttime to commit violent attacks. They're doing it under the sun. On your screen, you're seeing a brutal assault on a wedding photographer in San Francisco, right in the city of San Francisco from earlier this month. The photographer was pistol whipped in front of the newlyweds. But it's not just there. Across the country, in New York City, a 12-year-old girl was just dragged down the street by robbers on a motorbike. Here's a report from Fox 5.
The video is horrifying. Two men on a motor scooter approach a 12-year-old girl from behind, grab her necklace, and then drag her down the sidewalk.
It's scary to go out in the streets like most of the time, but Other than that, like, kids should be safe.
Police say the two men have struck at least 7 times in 3 weeks in Elmhurst, Corona, and Jackson Heights, Queens. 4 of those robberies happening on the same day.
Oh, so it's Caracas now, and we're not doing anything about it. Ask anyone who owns a business in downtown Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills even. It's completely out of control. And the reason it is because police aren't punishing people the way they did. In New York City, a man was just busted with 20,000 fentanyl pills in Chelsea, which was a nice neighborhood in New York, and he was released immediately. So this doesn't work. The question is, what does work? One of the smartest people we've talked to in our hour-long Fox Nation show in the last year is a woman called Ginny Burton. She's 50, she's a mother of 3, and for most of her life, she was badly addicted to drugs. And while addicted, she committed a slew of crimes, car theft, she even shot somebody. She racked up 17 separate felony convictions and served 3 separate terms in prison. And then she did something that too many do. She got total control of her life. She even graduated college. And in the process of that, gained a lot of wisdom. And so it's with great pleasure that we welcome Ginny Burton to the show tonight. Ginny, thanks so much for coming on. So you've seen this from both sides, as a drug-addicted person committing crimes and a clear-thinking person with hard-earned wisdom assessing what's happening to the country. What should we be doing differently, do you think?
Well, we need to be incarcerating with intention, Tucker, which, you know, this administration is definitely not addressing any of the necessary components of what's happening in our society right now. They're using a harm reduction approach, not just to drugs, but also to crime, and that's extremely problematic.
So you say incarceration with intention. So the idea is if you put someone behind bars, it's cruel. You're really the criminal for wanting to do that. And you're saying, having been in prison 3 separate times, it can be good not just for society, but for the person incarcerated. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. When we incarcerate with intention, which neither side has done up to this point, but we're seeing a rapid decline in our communities and with humanity in general, you know, and the United States is sort of leading the way with that. We're taking this harm reduction approach everywhere, and what's happening is we're seeing an increase in overdose deaths and a decrease in incarceration. But when we incarcerate with intention, what we would essentially be doing is implementing services during incarceration that actually help people to take control of their own lives. And what this would also do is it would create more of a safety net in the community. People that have been victimized, people that have been impacted by those who are committing crimes, which I want to say that probably I would say upwards of 90+% of people that are in active addiction commit crimes, and those that are committing crimes are also using drugs and alcohol. So these underlying causes would be addressed very intentionally so that we're making sure that we're attacking the problems when we have people separated from the destructive path, if that makes sense.
So addiction means crime, not just because you're breaking the law by using drugs, but you are driven to crime. So my question, really simple to you, do you think you ever would have gotten better as a drug addict, and you were definitely a drug addict, would you have gotten better if you hadn't been incarcerated?
No, and I'll be honest with you, I'm extremely grateful in this moment that that incarceration was an option for me, because if I was using today with the policies that are in place right now, I wouldn't be where I am. We're denying people an opportunity to actually thrive and to get their lives back. What I can tell you about my own experience is that I didn't have the necessary skills to navigate society. And if not for that separation, I wouldn't have been able to accumulate the different kind of services that I did in order to get me to where I am today. So when we know, and we've gained a lot of intel over the last number of decades since the famous 1994 crime bill, which was authored by Joe Biden, in case people don't know, that exacerbated incarceration in this nation, and it also pulled services out of our carceral systems. And so, you know, so we have a lot of information at this point of what is needed, but we're denying people that opportunity. We went from one end of the pendulum all the way over to this other side. Harm reduction is inaction. And inaction is actually an action. And what it is sending a message that no lives matter in this nation.
Harm reduction is inaction. Inaction says the message that no lives matter. I really hope that people are hearing you and that you get a chance to get your voice out there, because I think it's very necessary. Jenny Burton, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tucker.
More news straight ahead. Thanks for spending the last hour with us. That was fun. There are good things happening in this country, and we're going to do our best to find them. We'll be back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. In the meantime, Sean Hannity takes over now. Have the best night.